Everybody, it's Mr. Clark again with another chance to excel. Today we're going to talk about the next two divisions of plants. Last time we talked about the bryophytes, which were the mosses, and we talked about alternation of generation. And today we're going to talk about a group in whole that's called the pteridophytes that include the club mosses, which isn't a moss, and the ferns. And we're going to be talking primarily about ferns because those are the ones that we see around here. Ferns are vascular plants. That means they have tubes that allow them for carrying water and nutrients. And so this allows them to grow much taller than the bryophytes. In the case of ferns, here in New Hampshire, the largest species of fern is called the royal king fern and stands about 6 feet tall. But you can see that's quite an advantage over the bryophytes, being able to grow tall and access sunlight and essentially shade out the smaller bryophytes. However, this group is still tied to water and living in moist areas for their reproduction. So if we look at their life cycle, they exhibit alternation of generation as well. And when I say the word fern, you typically think of the frond that is the sporophyte form. So in ferns, the sporophyte form is the dominant form, so it's made of cells that are diploid, 2N. They have 2 copies of each of the chromosome pairs. And then if you were to look, especially this time of year, if you look at the underside of the frond, you can see the reproductive structures, the spore producing. So right down here, you can see on the underside of the frond, those little dots are called sporangia, and they produce the spores. And so via meiosis, they produce spores that are carried by the wind, land on a new spot, and by mitosis grow into the gametophyte form. And the gametophyte form is a very reduced in size, usually about the size of maybe a eraser on a pencil. And those cells are made of haploid cells, so 1 copy of each chromosomes. And on them, they have both male and female parts. That are sort of dotted here. The male parts are right in that area, and the female parts are right in that area. And so the females, they're going to produce egg cells by mitosis, and the males are going to produce sperm cells by mitosis. And then with a film of water, those sperm cells are going to swim and fertilize the egg right on that green heart-shaped gametophyte is where that takes place. And so the new sporophyte kind of grows right out of the top of that. And so that's the life cycle of a fern. The sporophyte is the dominant form there, and the gametophyte is reduced. If we look at the next plant group, we can see the evolution of something very important in the plant kingdom, and that is the evolution of a seed. And the two groups here, the gymnosperms, which I'll talk about today, and angiosperms next time. But the gymnosperms, they produce their seeds. Sometimes it's called the naked seed approach, in that their seed isn't protected within a fleshy body like the angiosperms are. But examples of these are ginkgo. Maybe you've heard of ginkgo before. Kind of an interesting and ancient tree. There's only one species remaining. It's interesting in a whole bunch of ways. One way is that it has both male trees and female trees. That's kind of interesting. And it has a deciduous leaf, which is different from the other ones, but very interesting and very old species. Cycads, which kind of dominated during the Jurassic and Triassic time. And for our purposes, we're going to be talking about a conifer as an example, because that's kind of what we see here in New Hampshire. And I'd like you to take a look at conifers, maybe a little closer than you ever have before in the next few days. If you can go out and find a pine tree, you can see their reproductive structures on display right now, quite visible. If you look at sort of the top of the tree, you will see the female cones. So the tree itself is the sporophyte generation, so its cells are diploid cells. And living right on that tree is the female cone, which is where the gametophyte resides, inside that cone. And so that's where the eggs are going to be made by meiosis. But then if you look closely at the tree, particularly at generally the lower branches down here, you'll see the male cones. And they're not around very long, but they're around for several weeks, right around May and early June produce lots of pollen by meiosis. So this is the male gametophyte here on those male cones. And in the next couple weeks, if you go and you shake that branch, you'll see the pollen shake off of it. So in the life cycle of a pine tree, the pollen is produced here in the male cones, and through wind, it's carried and fertilizes the eggs that are inside of the female cone. And so this little structure here is showing one of the what are called bracts, one of those little wooden things that is opening up that protects the seed, but that seed is naked to the world. And as it develops, it will fall out of that cone, female cone, and the seed will then germinate into the next tree or the next sporophyte generation. So that's a overview of gymnosperms, and I'm going to attach some animations for both the fern reproduction and the gymnosperm reproduction, and I hope all that helps.